Hey, thank you for tuning in to another episode of In Range. I'm Carl, and we are on site in Miracle Valley, Arizona. In 1982, this was the site of a horrendous melee between local sheriffs, DPS, and a Chicago transplanted Pentecostal cult, which resulted in a couple deaths and an actual shootout. But I want to give you a little background information first. So right here where I'm standing behind me is A.A. Allen's Bible College Church, for lack of a better term. In the 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s, A.A. Allen was essentially a drunk that got converted to Christianity within contact with Oral Roberts. He decided that he was going to become a preacher himself and formed his own traveling tent church revival effort. That was a common thing at the time. And he became quite powerful, had his tent movement across the country, and at some point actually ordained over 10,000 people as other preachers as part of his ministry.
Do you see the devil in this man's eyes? This thing is coming out of this man. It's demon spirits that have driven him crazy and insane. In the name of Jesus Christ, I come against you. Satan, you are defeated and you know it. You're coming out of him once and for all. And you're going to let him go. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord.
Yes, Lord.
Yes, God, right now.
Yes, Lord.
Right now, Jesus.
Right now, Jesus. Right now, Jesus. Right now.
At any rate, he was doing a tent revival up in Phoenix, and a rancher from Palominas, who's just down the road here, was visiting this tent revival. And in that tent revival, he felt moved by God to donate a large portion of his ranch to A.A. Allen's ministry, and that's the land we're standing on right now. As a result of that donation, they built this Bible community church behind us, and his ministry moved here to be centered in, oddly, rural Cochise County, Arizona. A.A. Allen was actually well accepted into the community and was sort of renowned for his healing capabilities. In fact, a local person, her son was actually shot in a gun accident, and when the cops told her that her son was at the morgue, her first reaction was, "I need to get the body to bring it to A.A. Allen so he can resurrect him." There was another instance where a woman traveled across the country on Greyhound with a suitcase, and when she got here, or was intercepted before she got here, she was actually bringing her dead infant to this location so A.A. Allen could use his powers to resurrect this child from the dead. In 1970, A.A. Allen died. His ministry was left a little bit adrift as a result. Some people say he died from rampant alcoholism. They refute that. Doesn't really matter. So after A.A. Allen died in 1970, one of the women he ordained, Frances Thomas, had started her own ministry in Chicago. And she was actually doing quite well with that ministry, but after his death, she was also spoken to by God and told that she should move her ministry to where A.A. Allen was centered here in Miracle Valley, Arizona. The property had been deeded to a local Hispanic church, and it was therefore could not be sold for 20 years. So she bought the property just north of Highway 92 and turned it into front site for cultists. So if you don't know what Front Sight is a shooting training center in Nevada. It was formed as this sort of sketchy industry where you would have to pay ahead of time for everything, not only your training, but also these timeshares that are there, and people have invested in the timeshares, and they were trying to build this whole community that was going to be this pro-gun training timeshare pyramid scheme thing. Not really that much unlike the PTL Club's Jim Baker's Praise Camp or whatever he called it. But this was that equivalent in the early 1980s run by Frances Thomas. So Frances Thomas moved her community church here to Miracle Valley, Arizona. It was essentially a urban Chicago black Pentecostal church moving to rural white Arizona. These two groups, right off the bat, don't mix. It's oil and water. The local community probably had basically built-in racism towards black people. This urban black community coming to rural Arizona had no idea how to deal with white rural Arizona.
They just come down with a big city chip on their shoulder, and it's not like that down here.
Instant conflict. It didn't take long for things to arise.
They are a threat to us.
An example of that would be an event that happened at the local high school. What was probably kind of a standard high school squabble, although racially motivated, got worse the next day. the community church decided they were not going to stand for this, and during normal school hours, they sent a number of adults with some of the high school kids back to the school to essentially exact revenge. The community found out about that, called the police. The police show up at the high school, so now you've got church members, cultists, potentially white racists, we don't really know, sheriffs involved, all in one place at one time, and the community church members turned on the cops and it turned into a melee at the high school. So the cops are now dealing with these people, fighting with them in a physical altercation. A local couple from Sierra Vista are literally carjacked by some of the cultists, and a high-speed chase ensued down Highway 92 back to the community church residences. And when these people got into the community church blockaded the way, and the sheriffs and cops could not get in to arrest these ne'er-do-wells. They literally prevented them from getting in there to do that. So on that note, we have already mentioned these different communities did not understand one another at all, and both sides were very distrustful of one another.
There is mostly black people here, and they don't want that.
They're trying to picture me as some redneck maniac assassin.
The sheriffs, cops, white local residents felt deeply distrustful of this black community that moved in, thinking that, of course, they're just criminals here to cause trouble.
And they're not going to come out and stop my car because I'll have blood all over it.
The black community that moved in saw these white people as racist and purposely persecuting them for ridiculous things that they weren't even doing, like false traffic violations, just generally giving them trouble in general when they were out in public. So both sides were just incredibly distrustful. And in fact, that was part of the reason that in a couple instances they blocked the police officers from being able to arrest some of their members, fearing that when these people were taken into custody they would be beaten and or killed, justifiably or no, we don't know, but while in custody. So they felt that they were defending their own from what would be ultimately a violent situation. Stuff like this escalates, however, and this is a great instance of where that occurred. One of the church members had been arrested and was being retained at the Sierra Vista jail. The church members, potentially fearing for his safety, or just because of their resentment towards law enforcement in general, decided they were going to break him out. At that time, you could go to a local hardware store and buy dynamite. That was not an uncommon thing. People used it to blow up stumps, mining, whatever. It was considered just a household tool, an item. So the breakout plan was thus. They took a van, armed it full of bombs, started heading west towards the Sierra Vista jail. They were going to detonate the bombs in cars to create a distraction and detonate a hole in the wall with the dynamite and bombs that were on the van. They were also backed up by a car behind them filled with what they called this, not us, commandos for Christ. As they were prepping the bombs, one of them detonated in Brother Stevie's lap, blowing up the van. One of the women on the van was talking at the time, and she said the worst part of the event was swallowing 2 mouthfuls of Brother Stevie's gore in the process of this detonation. Brother Stevie was killed, the van was of course destroyed, others were wounded. This of course brought the interest of the authorities. When they came to investigate, they found other bombs, bomb-make material on the van, and that of course escalated their concerns about what was going on here in Miracle Valley with this cult organization. So this story about the release of these 15 suspects from the community was really becoming a media event. KOLD from Tucson came down to film some B-roll, kind of much like what we're doing right here on the property right now. And while they were getting their gear out of their truck, cameras, audio gear, whatever, a bunch of women from the church came out, just dressed in sweaters, and suddenly revealed they had claw hammers underneath their sweaters, pulled them out and started threatening the media crew. Not only threatening, throwing the hammers at them multiple times. The KOLD media crew decided they needed to get out of there before they were killed. While they were throwing their gear back in the car to get out, the hammers hit the car multiple times, luckily did not hit them, and they screeched out of here at high speed. Unluckily for the church members, there was another media crew behind them that videoed all of this. This video event actually finally changed community sentiment against the cult. A lot of people at that time felt, well, maybe law enforcement really is persecuting these people unfairly. Maybe they are getting a bad shake. Well, this video of hammers being thrown at KOLD media members changed all that. As a result of that, they finally were forced to negotiate the release of these 15 suspects. And as a result of these 15 suspects being released, things kind of calmed down. A couple months of not too much conflict. However, that only lasted a little while, and things continued to escalate again. And there were bench warrants issued for 3 cult members for a myriad of things, traffic violations, whatever. We have no idea of the authenticity of those claims against them, but they had legal warrants. So they send in the sheriff to come arrest these folks. They send in one car with 2 sheriffs, and they had 37 officers standing in the background just in case they needed backup. They tried to not escalate the situation right on the north side of Highway 92. The car parked on the street on the side. One officer went in to knock on the doors to serve the warrants. Okay, so this officer starts to knock on doors at houses around 7:30 a.m. in the morning, trying to catch people off guard, early, probably sleeping. First house, nobody there, seems empty. Nobody on the streets, it's quiet. Goes to the next house. Again, nobody there, empty, quiet. But then people start showing up out of the blue, start coming out of their homes, start kind of seeing him there. A crowd starts to gather. Finally, when the officer's on the porch of the third house, the crowd is in number, and they have surrounded him. Little did the officers know that the actual cult realized that the cops were coming there to serve this warrant. They thought that it was going to be coming at night, not in the morning. When the morning came, they had all sort of lulled themselves to sleep, realizing, oh, this isn't going to happen. But they had been waiting in the domiciles, armed and ready for this. Guns, clubs, whatever. While he's standing on the third porch, a Buick screeches to a halt behind him. 2 men get out, one of them armed with a pipe, and they start verbally threatening him and swinging the pipe at him. And he, as an officer, is just dodging this pipe because he's surrounded by these assailants, and he's thinking through his mind, if he were to draw his gun at this point, it's going to result in worse violence. He also doesn't think he's going to win. His partner jumps out of the car, runs up, and disarms the man with the pipe, surprising the crowd, handcuffing him, and they start to pull him away to the car. The crowd's so surprised by this change of events, they're not sure how to react. But then they finally recoup, regather, and start coming towards them. At this point, they call for support. They say, send 1 car. No, send 2. Wait, send them all. And that's exactly what happened. So at this point, 15 cars, 30-something officers arrive on the scene, and it turns into a Chicago urban-style riot. Mostly bludgeon weapons, rebar, sticks, bats, clubs, hammers, pipes, versus these officers. Somewhere between 130 and 150 cultists versus 30-something officers. Individual little fights erupt everywhere. These officers are trying to restrain the situation, calm it down, and are not, in an amazing, in my opinion, an amazing example of restraint, not reverting to using their firearms. Part of the reason that these officers are reluctant to actually even fight back, they don't even start hitting back, is because the cult had formed a strategy of using women as the front line of assailants against the officers. Kind of like what happened with the KOLD media, and the women came out with claw hammers under their sweaters. The majority of people beating on the cops were also women. Not entirely, mostly. And it worked. These rural backwater officers were very reluctant to strike women. Some of them, potentially, not elderly, but older black women. They didn't want to hit them, even if they're being swung at with a pipe. So that strategy, oddly, worked. However, just like World War I, it's one giant battle, but it devolved into small little individual fights scattered throughout the property. Some examples of these individual fights that occurred in the giant battle. A 12-year-old kid comes out with a .22 revolver, starts to point it at the cop. The cop pulls out his pistol, says, "Don't do this, get out of here." The kid runs off. Again, amazing restraint, actually. Another officer encounters a man armed with nunchucks. Sounds like something out of an action flick, but apparently this guy knew how to use them. If you can swing nunchucks and not hurt yourself, you're probably pretty capable with them. The officer decided, I don't want to deal with nunchucks, pulled his pistol, that guy backed off again and just joined back into the general melee. This was a reoccurring theme. Officers being hit with clubs, sticks, trying to avoid being hit. One officer was hit so badly with rebar that his arm split open and bone extruded out of his arm. Another officer was bludgeoned so badly with a board that he actually did die 30 days later from the wounds. So this general melee is really a fist fight. It's a riot. The majority of people there are not in it for murder. They're just in it to fight. They're getting it out. Some people are shooting guns over the heads of the crowd as a warning, I guess, for lack of a better terms, although at least one of the cultists was hit by one of the other cultists by a .22 and paralyzed as a result of that. However, there's a small subset of diehards, you know, that 3%, that suddenly decide, no, we're going to take this to another level. One of them pulls out a shotgun, fires it at a Bronco or Blazer that an officer's in, blows the window out, fires again and hit the officer. Must have been birdshot, we don't know for a fact. It did not kill the officer, but he was badly wounded by the shotgun. Another officer saw this from across the way, removed his service revolver, a .38, and fired at him. Didn't hit him, but suppressed the two guys with the shotgun. Simultaneously, There's another officer on scene, which was one of the SWAT snipers, armed with a Mini 14 and a scope and a cool Tac-to-Mag Mini 14 jungle clip. And he's there trying to not turn this into gunfire. And the preacher's son shows up coldly, walking across this battlefield with a Winchester 94 cocked and ready to fire. He said the guy looked like he had a dead stare, no expression at all. Walking across the field, suddenly starts to bring up the Winchester 94, and the officer with the Mini 14 lit him up with 4 rounds from the hip. Hit him with all 4 rounds according to the count. Guy fell dead. So that guy's dead. Real bloodshed now. The father-in-law of that son sees this happen, calmly walks up again, supposedly without an expression, picks up the Winchester 94, goes to aim it, and the same officer fires another 4 rounds from the same Mini 14 from the hip, laying waste to him. He falls dead as a doornail. After this point, 2 guys are laying dead on the ground next to their Winchester 94, which, by the way, disappeared. According to the police report, the Winchester 94 was skirted away by one of the participants. So that's lost from the records and from the evidence. However, 2 guys laying dead on the ground from the 8 well-placed shots from a Mini 14, everyone decides this isn't that much fun anymore, and it starts to calm down. So this essentially ended the fight. People decided they didn't want any more of this. A number of the cultists were arrested as a result. 25 officers were severely wounded. 2 cultists were killed by that Mini 14. Another cultist who was paralyzed in the back with a .22 fired by one of his own team died in 1987 from complications from the wound. So if you want to chalk up a death toll, 1 dead officer, 25 severely wounded, 3 dead cultists as a result of this one-day event. Shortly thereafter, the funerals for those 2 dead cultists were being held in Chicago, and the majority of the community went to Chicago for that funeral. After that, most of them left. They pretty much left. They didn't want to be here anymore. That was the end of this. En masse, this community went back to Chicago or wherever they landed up at that point. Surprisingly, no one was actually ever convicted of a crime as a result of this. 21 of the cultists were charged with 70 unique felonies. They could not provide for their own defense, so the county was legally required to do so. However, Cochise County is not a rich county, especially not in the 1980s, and they could not afford to defend these 21 cultists for their 70 charges. It was bankrupting the county. As a result of not being able to provide the financial support to defend these people, the judge threw out all the charges with prejudice, which prejudice meaning they could not be recharged again. So all of this, bloodshed, bludgeoning, fighting, ended with a squeak. These people got away for whatever they were charged with. Maybe they were innocent, maybe they were guilty. They never actually saw a court as a result of it. And that was the end of this conflict in Miracle Valley, Arizona. So you might ask, what is there to learn about gunfighting from this? Well, there's a lot to learn from this event. From gunfighting perspective, if you're surrounded by a mob, even if they're armed with just fists, pulling out a gun, it's probably a bad call. And I think the officers made a good decision at that point. Overwhelming force against 1 gun is still overwhelming force. All it would have done was escalate it to even something worse. And all of those officers that day, for the most part, seemed to actually figure that out. That's an important lesson. That's an important lesson for law enforcement. It's an important lesson for just a regular civilian. It's an important lesson for a CCW carrier. Gun guys frequently think to themselves, well, I've got a gun, I'm okay. Well, if you take the right kind of training, something like South Narc's ShivWorks class, the ECQC class, you learn very quickly that going to the gun first is frequently the wrong call. And those officers made the right call. We also learned that, even though I wouldn't call it tactically sound and I wouldn't advise for it, a well-trained person at the right distance can absolutely fire from the hip. That officer hit 8 times with 8 rounds fired with a Mini 14 from the hip. That's interesting as well. We also learned that birdshot, which is what we believe was used, isn't all that lethal. We knew that already, but this is another example of that happening. Beyond that, there's a lot more to learn from this. There's a sociological element to this, which unfortunately continues throughout history. We see this in the 1700s, 1800s, 1880s, the Irish, the Chinese, the black, the white, the whatever. This is a recurring theme. This is as recent as 1982. Obviously, events in Ferguson. Doesn't matter who's right or wrong. We need to evolve beyond this stupidity. Let's take examples like this, learn from them, and I'd like you guys watching this video to show that restraint with how you comment on this video below. Show that we're evolving. Let's learn, let's accept everybody for their differences, and move on. Thank you for watching another In-Range video. If you like this kind of work, please support us on Patreon. If you can't support us there, just share. We want eyeballs. We want people to see these messages. Thank you for watching.